My name is Danilo Petranovich, and today on behalf of the Yale Center for the Study of Representative Institutions, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Professor Gordon Wood. As many of you know, our center was started last year by Professor of History Keith Wrightson and Professor of Political Science Stephen Smith with the support of the Jack Miller Center. Our purpose is the closer study of the theory and practice of representative government in the Anglo-American tradition. To find out more about us, please visit our website. Gordon S. Wood is one of America's preeminent scholars of the founding period. Here at Yale, as Professor Smith reminded me, he is better known as the father of art historian Chris Wood. Gordon Wood is the Alva University professor and professor of history emeritus at Brown University. He received his BA degree from Tufts University and his PhD from Harvard. He taught at Harvard and the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. He is the author of numerous books, among them The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, which won the Bancroft Prize and the John H. Dunning Prize in 1970, and he is the author of The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize in 1993. He was also recently awarded the National Medal for the Humanities. Professor Wood reviews in the New York Review of Books and the New Republic. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Professor Wood is also a member of the Jack Miller Center Academic Council. In one of the most famous scenes in the film Good Will Hunting, the character played by Matt Damon, a very bright, towny kid working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, gets into an argument with a Harvard graduate student whom he accuses of uncritically parroting the views of the authors on his reading list. The clever townie then goes on to predict that a little later in his studies, the graduate student would soon be, quote, regurgitating Gordon Wood. An implication is that the best and the brightest in our institutions of higher learning are content to follow the well-established opinions. Well, this afternoon, you're invited to try to prove Hollywood wrong, to go beyond regurgitation, and if you wish, to engage critically with some of Professor Wood's ideas on the subject of representation in the American Revolution. Question and answer session will follow. Please come up to one of the mics as we're recording this talk today. Thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Professor Wood to this podium.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. What Matt Damon's character goes on to say, what if you really want to read a good book, you got to read Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a close friend of the late Howard Zinn was a close friend of the Damon family. They all grew up in Boston. Now, okay, this is about representation in the American Revolution. And I think of all of the conceptions of political theory that run through that period, from the 1760s to the drafting of the Constitution, there's none more important than the issue of representation. Beginning, of course, with the imperial crisis in the 1760s and extending to the debate over the Constitution in 1787. In each case, those great debates are about representation. In fact, if representation is defined as the means by which people participate in government, the fulfillment of a proper representation, I think, became the goal and the measure of the revolution itself. The whole object of the present controversy, as Jefferson put it in 1776. Therefore, representation wasn't simply an issue between the British and the Americans. It was an issue among the Americans themselves. And in the process, Americans began fashioning a radically new conception of representation. I think new, at least in the English-speaking world, and a conception whose implications were not fully drawn out until the debate over the federal Constitution. By 1787, 1788, many Americans had come to believe that they alone, among the peoples of the Western world, had come to understand the true meaning of representation. Only by profoundly transforming the traditional way in which the people participated in government could Americans explain the conception of federalism. Only then could they explain the revolutionary idea that the people were equally represented in 2 or 3 or more institutions of government at the same time. And only then was the modern conception of democracy, indeed, I think the modern conception of politics, was made meaningful. Now, the issue begins, I think serious discussion of the issue begins with the imperial debate with Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act, which, as you know, taxed paper products, essentially, in the colonies. Once the English ministry sensed a stirring of colonial opposition to this Stamp Act, a group of English pamphleteers, able pamphleteers, usually connected with the government, sub-ministers and so on, set out to explain and to justify what they had done in passing that tax. And before they were finished, these British polemicists had revealed the assumptions on which the entire British, I think, English theory of politics rested. Although they differed, these various pamphleteers, all of them eventually centered on the point that the Americans, like all Englishmen, were comprehended by acts of Parliament through a system of what they called virtual representation. Even though the colonists, like 9/10 of the people of Britain, did not, in fact, choose any representatives to the House of Commons, declared Thomas Whately, who was the undersecretary who'd actually written the act, they were undoubtedly, Whately went on, they were undoubtedly a part and an important part of the Commons of Great Britain. They are represented in Parliament in the same manner as those inhabitants of Britain are who have no voices in elections. For the English election, this is hard, I think, for us to comprehend, but it's important to comprehend it. Election was incidental to representation. People did not actually have to vote for members of Parliament to be represented there. There were lots of people in England who did not vote, and yet, said Whately, they are represented in and taxed by Parliament. In fact, declared Whately, all British subjects were really in the same situation. None are actually, all are virtually represented. For every member of Parliament sits in the House, not as a representative of his own constituents, but as one of that august assembly by which all the commons of Great Britain are represented. Now, to most mainstream Englishmen back home in the mother country, these arguments made a great deal of sense. Centuries of history had left Britain with confusing mixture of sizes and shapes of its electoral districts. Some of the constituencies were large, with thousands of voters, but others were small and more or less in the pocket of a single landowner. Many of the electoral districts had few voters, and some so-called rotten boroughs, like Old Sarum, had no inhabitants at all, but nonetheless sent 2 members to the House of Commons. The town of Dunwich continued to send representatives to Parliament, even though it had long since slipped into the North Sea. At the same time, some of England's largest cities, such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, which had grown suddenly in the mid-18th century, these large cities sent no representatives to the House of Commons. Now, what made this conception of virtual representation, and virtual we should, in our own world today, should come to appreciate better than the Americans in the 18th century, what made this conception of virtual representation intelligible, what gave it force, I think, in English thought, was the assumption that the English people, despite great degrees of rank and property, despite even the separation of 3,000 miles of ocean between the English subjects, they were all essentially a unitary homogeneous estate or order with a fundamental common interest that could be promoted legitimately by an elite. British officials believed that each member of Parliament represented not just the particular locality that he supposedly came from, but the whole British nation. As Edmund Burke told his Bristol constituents in 1774, which is the most celebrated expression of this assumption, I think, in the literature in the 18th century, Parliament, said Burke, was not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, but a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, that transcended local interests. I might point out that he didn't win that election in Bristol with that kind of speech. But for this reason, the older medieval requirement that the members of Parliament reside in the constituencies they represented had long since been ignored, and of course such a residency requirement even today is not required for MPs in Britain. It was also understandable that the English defenders of virtual representation made light of the electoral process by which members were sent to Parliament. Election, as I say, was not what gave the member his representative power. That came ultimately from the mutuality of interest that the MP presumably shared with the whole Commons for whom he spoke. Only this concept of virtual representation, said Whately, and this is a very crucial point, I think he put his finger on a central justification for virtual representation. Only this concept ultimately justified the binding of the whole people by the consent of the majority of that House. When you think about it, if election is the crucial thing in representation, then are you not represented by the person that you didn't vote for? What if your opponent wins? And this can be handled by the concept of virtual representation, but it's a little tricky if you don't believe in that. Why should you obey a representative for whom you didn't vote? If election is the criterion, as the Americans thought, of representation. And Whately put his finger on that, I think, very important point, which justifies majority rule. Otherwise, there's no real reason why you should accept the will of a person that did not get your vote. But of course, the Americans immediately rejected this concept and emphatically rejected this British claim that they, the colonists, like the inhabitants of Manchester and Birmingham, were virtually represented in the House of Commons in the same manner, as they put it, with the non-electors resident in Great Britain. And in a flood of publications, they said that such a claim was absurd. Stamp Act Congress, I think, of 1765 summed up the American position. There's many different conceptions, and they seem to shift back and forth, but I think they summed up the American position that the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be, represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain. And through all of the adjustments, all of the shifting that took place over the next few years, that fundamental position was never shaken. Now, in rejecting the British claim that Americans were virtually represented in the English House of Commons, however, some of the colonists never decisively repudiated the concept of virtual representation. That is to say, they knew that there had to be some justification for why there were non-electors in America who were nonetheless represented. They also believed that society was a home, many of them believed that society in the colonies was an organic whole, and therefore some elites could speak for the rest of the society. As a young Alexander Hamilton pointed out in 1775, the intimate connection of interest among electors, non-electors, and representatives, and not simply the right to vote, said Hamilton, was what really made representation viable. Now, this is most obvious in the Americans' denial of the franchise to women and to young men. And some such notion of virtual representation, a natural identity of interest between electors and non-electors, lay behind the various property qualifications for the suffrage that was generally required even in the new revolutionary state constitutions drafted in 1776. When some Americans in 1776 actually objected to these property qualifications and demanded that the franchise be extended to all adult males, the Constitution makers were compelled to fall back on reassertions in one form or another, of this idea of virtual representation. Always emphasizing, of course, as Richard Henry Lee did, the great difference between the Americans' case against Britain and that of the unrepresented in this country. Now, these American concessions to the idea of virtual representation, however, tended to be overwhelmed by the outcry that they could never be virtually represented in the House of Commons. Certainly not in the same way that the non-voters of cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Sheffield were. First, some colonists argued that there was no mutuality of interest between the colonies and the mother country. So they accepted the notion of virtual representation, but said, well, we don't have any mutual interests. And in fact, they pointed out, which is a crucial point, I think, in terms of thinking about representation, that the members of Parliament and the English themselves were not sharing in the tax that was levied on them. That is, it was exclusively pointed at the colonists. And they said, well, how can we have this if Congress or if the members of Parliament themselves are not have to pay the tax? Of course, they had their own stamp taxes in England, but nonetheless, this was the argument that many in America made. But most, I think, simply challenged the whole idea of virtual representation itself and drew on their historical experience to replace it with what they called actual representation. I mean, these terms were used in the debate. If the people were to be properly represented in a legislature, the colonists said, not only did the people have to vote directly for the members of the legislature, but they also had to be represented by members whose numbers were proportionate to the size of the population they spoke for. No old serums for them. If you're going to have a district or a new town created, you're going to have representation. So what seemed meaningful in England made no sense whatsoever in the colonies. Unlike England, electoral districts in the New World were not the products of history going back centuries, but rather were recent and regular creations that were related to changes in population. When new towns in Massachusetts were created or new counties in Virginia were formed, new representatives customarily were sent to the respective colonial legislatures. 2 representatives from the new town, 2 burgesses to the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Now, this system of actual representation stressed the closest possible connection between the local electors and their representatives. Unlike the English, Americans believed that the representatives had to be residents of the localities that they spoke for, and that, of course, is still true even today, and that people of the localities generally had the right to instruct their representatives. So they were kind of ambassadors, despite what Burke said. This, I think, is more important than anything, was that they thought it only fair that the localities be represented more or less in proportion to their population. And when the New York draws up its state constitution in 1777, they write into the Constitution something that we built into the federal Constitution, which was an innovation for the age, that periodically the representation would be adjusted in accord with changes in the population in the state. So that what you had, I think, by the end of the Constitution making in the states in 1776, 77, the fullest and most equal participation of the people in the processes of government that the world had ever seen. Despite the fact that women could not vote and that blacks, slaves, of course, did not vote, nonetheless, the percentage of white adult males was higher than any place else in the world. And most places, of course, didn't have any resembling a representative system. In England, probably 1 out of 6 adult males could vote. And in America, it was closer to 2 out of 3. Now, since this actual representation, and this, I think, is a crucial point that runs through the whole period, right up into our own time, is based on the people's mistrust of those they elected, the colonists and the Americans pushed for the most explicit and broadest kind of consent, which, of course, fundamentally meant, at least initially, voting. The mutuality of interest that made virtual representation meaningful in England was in America so weak, so tenuous, that the representatives could not be trusted to speak for the interests of their constituents unless they actually voted for them. There was no sense of really of mutual trust. Actual representation thus made the process of election not incidental, as it was in England, but central to the whole process of representation. And this actual representation, I think, became the key to the peculiarities of American constitutionalism and American government. Many Americans wanted elected officials who were like themselves in every way, not only in ideas, in what they promoted as their platform, if you will, but in religion, in ethnicity, in social class. Now, you have actually early examples of this, even in 1775 in Philadelphia, when these revolutionary committees were formed, Committee of 18, Committee of 19, Committee of 50. Groups kept asking, well, why aren't we there? And the artisans said, we don't have any artisans on the committee. They're all gentlemen. There are no Germans on the committee. We want some Germans. There are no Presbyterians on these committees. We want some Presbyterians. You actually have identity politics emerging as early as 1775 in America. This, of course, would continue and, of course, is very much a part of American politics today. That the representative not only had to be for the people, he had to be of the people. He had to resemble the constituents that he spoke for. Now, there's a continual struggle over these issues of representation during the following decade into the 1780s, which I think is the most important decade in American history, out of which, of course, came our Constitution. And that was not at all foreseen in 1776. No one in his wildest imaginations even conceived of such a strong federal government as emerged. So something awesome, something terrific had to happen in that decade. And that's why, and of course it did, and that's why I think the decade is the most important in our history. To make a complicated story short, I believe that the abuses of the concept of actual representation lay behind much of the crisis of the 1780s. The critical period was critical because of democratic excesses fed by these notions of actual representation. Majorities in the state legislatures were running amok and casting doubt on the possibility of Republican government. And this, of course, became not just James Madison's, although he's the most articulate expresser of this view, this became his central concern, how to curb these rampaging majorities in the state legislatures, how to do that. Majoritarian factionalism, he called it, and he wrote a little essay for his own working paper called The Vices of the System of the United States, which outlines this fear of excessive democracy running wild. And the Federalists designed the Constitution, Madison in particular, but his ideas are shared by others, at least in large part, I think, because of to solve these abuses, to solve these problems flowing from these excesses of democracy. The Constitution, as a solution to the excesses of democracy, made representation a central issue in the ratification debates. In fact, representation became just as much of a central issue in 1787-88 as it had been in 1765 during the imperial crisis. Now, this debate is a fascinating one, and I think it's actually interesting, and for those of you interested in political theory, I think it illustrates very sharply how ideas change under pressure, under the requirements of engaging in popular debate. And you see the ideas changing really before your eyes. And I think it's a fascinating laboratory for the study of intellectual history. The debates raised once again this old distinction, as I say, between actual and virtual representation. I think through the structural devices of the federal government, the Federalists sought to promote, I guess you'd have to call it an elitist, although they didn't have that term, an elitist conception of virtual representation, even though political and social conditions in America were making such a conception difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. By contrast, the opponents of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists as they were called, offered a spirited defense of actual representation. Indeed, they defended the most localist, the most particularist kind of actual representation voiced in the entire revolutionary era. And it was a conception of representation that I think was much more in accord with the emerging social and political realities of America, or at least the northern parts of America, than the sort of representation, virtual representation, advocated by the Federalists. And in that sense, the Anti-Federalists were on the right side of history, if you will, and the Federalists not, at least in part. It doesn't work out quite so neatly as that. Now, what did the Federalists want? Anybody who's read some of my work, you know what I think. They saw the problems of American politics in the 1780s stemming from its intense localism. localism in the states. In fact, from too much actual representation in these state legislatures. Not only had the great objects of the nation been sacrificed constantly to local views, but they said the general interests of the states had been sacrificed to local and special interests. The public good was lost in the scramble for private advantages, local favors, and there's the whole series of things that Madison talks about. Debtor relief legislation, particularly paper money, and of course he illustrates this in large part from my own state of Rhode Island, which was considered the pariah state because it was flooding the whole of southern New England with paper money and was the localist state run wild. Now, such developments were occurring precisely because those whom the Federalists called the best people, that was a term they often used, people like themselves, had lost control of state politics. Instead of choosing men for their abilities, integrity, and patriotism, said the Federalists, I'm quoting here from various publications, the people in the various local constituency had chosen men because they will vote for some in favor of some special interest, some special local interest. These representatives constantly mistook the particular circle in which they moved for the general voice of the society. They were parochial, they were narrow-minded. They had elected to their state legislatures men like such as William Finley of Pennsylvania, who was a former weaver, no education whatsoever. Abraham Yates of New York, who was a former cobbler. Men who lacked any kind of semblance of a college education and lacked the cosmopolitan outlook of college-educated gentlemen. This spirit of locality, promoted by such narrow-minded, illiberal, and that term was used meaning the opposite of a liberal arts education. When you don't have that, you're illiberal. And that spirit of locality, concluded James Madison in 1788, was inseparable, he said, from the American practice of electing representatives from small districts or small towns. Now, hence the Federalist remedy for the vices of American politics embodied in the new national government, in the Virginia plan that Madison brings to the convention, which provided in his initial plan for a veto power by the Congress over all state bills. No state legislature could have a bill made into a law until it had passed the Congress. That negative that he wanted was central to his system, and when he didn't get it, he was depressed and disillusioned. He thought the whole thing was going to fail. But we got something else instead. We got Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which prohibits the states from doing certain things. So what they hoped to do with this new national government was change the scale and the processes of representation. They were going to put it bluntly, they were going to narrow elevate the electorate, elevate and narrow the decision-making. Now, this is an insight, you might say a sociological insight, that's been used time and again in American politics. The progressives were very much, Samuel Hayes, a historian of 50 years ago, 40 years ago, wrote wonderfully on this issue. You're worried about ward bosses making decisions, elevate the decision-making. Get somebody else who's going to make a better decision. When you see blue ribbon commissions appointed, then you realize that's exactly what's happening. You're just going to try to get it out of the minds or out of the hands of the local ward bosses and get somebody who's got a little better outlook on things to make the decision. That's the kind of insight, the sociological insight that these Federalists had. The House of Representatives in the new national government, when you think about it, this is 4 million people, are going to have only 65 members. The initial House, and thus would be smaller than most of the state legislatures. I mean, the Massachusetts legislature was 360 members. Suddenly you're going to have a House representing the whole country, 13 states, 65. Think of what that meant. And if we compare these 65 representatives with the 1,000 or more state legislative members, you can get a better idea of what the Federalists were up to. Take a state like North Carolina, which had 232 people in its state legislature. It's going to have 5 congressmen going to the federal House of Representatives. Now, the idea is that since there are only about 5 college graduates in all of the state of North Carolina, that the chances of the college graduates ending up in the federal Congress were very high. And they certainly were not going to be able to dominate, and did not dominate, the state legislature of 232. So you are going to, by elevating decision-making to the national level, you're going to get a better class of person. They would be far more likely to ignore the illiberal parochial men. The people would, in electing their congressmen, would ignore these illiberal men with factious tempers. If you read through the Federalist Papers, there are these code words that appear every once in a while, Madison especially using them. People with factious tempers, local prejudices, who were dominating the state legislatures. The people instead would elect to the new federal government only those college-educated few who were, in James Wilson's words, another one of the great Federalists, men of intelligence and uprightness. These few gentry, it was hoped, would virtually represent all the diverse interests and occupations of the whole of this 4 million people in the American society. So by greatly enlarging the electoral districts and by severely decreasing the number of those who would represent the people and wield effective political power, the Federalists expected to free America from the evils of localism that had become so glaringly evident in the previous decade. The great height of the government, the new government, its great distance from parochial interests, would, it was hoped, prevent the obscure, illiberal, parochial, and narrow-minded men who had gained power in the state governments from scaling its higher walls. The new federal government, said Madison, would act as a kind of sieve, filtering, and I'm quoting you here, from the mass of the society the purest and noblest characters which it contains. Those who would represent the people in the federal legislature, because of the fewness of numbers and the breadth of the electorates, would be the best men in the country. Those natural social leaders who possess, in Madison's words, the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. This, in summary, is the Federalist view of things. Now, the Anti-Federalists were not stupid. They knew immediately what was happening. They knew that the Federalists were what they were up to. And they countered the Federalists' artificially contrived device for establishing virtual representation with a vehement defense of actual representation. And they launched extraordinary debate in all of the states, some of them more exciting than others. But I should point out that these debates are being published now up to about 24 volumes by now the editor-in-chief is John Kaminsky in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's an extraordinary collection of documents on all of the major issues of political theory, not just on representation, but on power, liberty, rights, the relationship between rulers and ruled, all of the things that political theorists are interested in. And it's an extraordinary collection. Now, there may have been richer debates in 5th century Athens, and there may have even been richer debates in 17th century England, but we don't know. We don't have the extent of information about those debates that we have about the Americans. This is an extraordinary collection, and it's scarcely been touched because political theory has not been central to, at least to historians over the last half century. It's only been in the last 40 years that these things have started being published in modern editions. Kaminsky and his colleagues have gathered almost everything together they can think of that has, from all the newspapers, all the pamphlets that relate to this debate over the Constitution. Now, the Anti-Federalists said over and over again, society was not a unitary organic hierarchy for which an elite of gentlemen could sympathetically speak. It said, instead, it was rather a heterogeneous mixture of many different classes or orders of people. And they set out a complicated view of American society made up of every occupation you could think of: merchants, farmers, planters, mechanics, gentry or wealthy men, each possessing distinct and often incompatible interests. They claimed that in such a diverse society, men from one class or group, however educated, however respectable, could never be acquainted with the situation and wants of those of another class or group. In other words, people from one part of the society could not speak for others. Certainly gentry could not speak for a artisan or a farmer. And they offered as full and as robust a defense of identity politics that the country had ever seen. Representation, they said, had to be truly a replication of the people in all of its diversity. Each local constituency, each occupation, each interest had to represent itself directly. Farmers, traders, and mechanics, declared the Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists, all ought to have a competent number of their best-informed members in the legislature. It was not enough that the representatives for the people, they had to be of the people. In, I think, the starkest articulation of this idea of actual representation made throughout the whole era. If the representatives were to know intimately the people's feelings, circumstances, and interests, they had to be truly of them. Only ordinary men not distinguished by the characteristics of aristocratic wealth, education, taste, could be trusted to speak for what were increasingly referred to as the middling and lower classes of people. So the Anti-Federalists come to oppose the new national government for the very reason the Federalists wanted it, because its very structure and detachment from the people would work to exclude any kind of actual and local interest being represented and prevent ordinary men from exercising political power. Now, Cecilia Kenyon, who was a political theorist at Smith, wrote a very path-breaking article probably 60 years ago now, Men of Little Faith, she was called, and she indicts the Anti-Federalists for being men of little faith, and that's true. They were men of little faith. They were mistrustful of government. She didn't like that. She came out on the side of the Federalists, but she had, the point was correct. They had no faith in what the Federalists were up to because they thought it was going to be a bunch of rich gentry who were going to be making all the decisions. They went on to say in Federalists, in many arguments, it went without saying, they said, that the awesome president and the exalted Senate would be dangerously far removed from the people. But they said, even the so-called democratic branch of the government, the House of Representatives, which presumably should possess the same interests and opinions that the people themselves would possess, were they all assembled, even that, with its scant 65 members, was a mere shred or rag of the people's power and hardly a match for the monarchical and aristocratic branches of the government. Of course, they're thinking in terms of the traditional mixed government that they had copied from and republicanized from England with a monarchical, aristocratic, and a democratic part. If only a half dozen congressmen were to be selected to represent a large state, rarely, argued the Anti-Federalists, rarely would such persons from the great body of the people, the middle and lower classes, be elected to the House of Representatives. The station is too high and exalted to be filled except by the first men of the state in point of fortune and influence. In fact, they claimed no ordinary folk will be represented in the House of Representatives, which was supposed to be the democratic branch of the government, except the rich and the wealthy. The Anti-Federalists thought that all that Americans had learned from the Revolution about the need to maintain the closest possible connection between constituents and representatives seemed to be threatened by the new federal Constitution. Now, the Federalists were not surprised by these arguments. They expected it. In fact, John Dickinson in the convention said, put it this way, aristocracy, he warned, will be the watchword, the shibboleth among its adversaries. And precisely because the Anti-Federalists, as Hamilton observed in the New York Ratifying Convention, did talk so often of an aristocracy, they didn't use the term elite, but that's what they meant by aristocracy. The Federalists were compelled in the ratification debates to minimize and obscure the aristocratic or elitist nature of what the system they had created. An open defense of the orthodox doctrine of virtual representation, with all that it implied of an organic and hierarchical conception of society ruled by a natural elite, smacked too much of an aristocracy or elitism, and they tried to stay away from it. Hamilton, in particular, was very much concerned in the ratification debates to deny that there was any such thing as an aristocracy. But then, of course, he made the exact opposite mistake in Federalist number 35. If you're familiar with it, it's a defense of virtual representation that any Englishman would support. He tries to defend, he's attacking the identity politics that's being thrown up by the Anti-Federalists. And he says the idea, and I'm quoting him here, the idea of an actual representation of all classes of the people by persons of each class, he wrote with more honesty than political sense, is altogether visionary. That was a term he often used about things he didn't like, that they were visionaries. Electing artisans and tradesmen to the legislature was impractical and unnecessary, he said. Mechanics and manufacturers will always be inclined, with few exceptions, to give their votes to merchants in preference to persons of their own profession or trades. They know that the merchant is their natural patron and friend, and that they are aware that however great the confidence they may justly feel in their own good sense, their interest can be more effectively promoted by the merchant than by themselves. I don't think they read each other's stuff. I don't think Madison would have let them get this go through, this 35, because it's really very, very damaging to the Federalist cause. Not only were the artisans and tradesmen caught up in their occupations, said Hamilton, but they lacked those acquired endowments without which, in a deliberative assembly, the greatest natural abilities are the most part useless. He went on to argue the same thing was true of farmers. They could count on the great planters to look after their interests. But then what he really wanted to do in that paper, it's a fantastically interesting paper, was justify representation by lawyers. As far as the learned professions, he uses that term, learned professions, but he wasn't really thinking about physicians and clergymen. He's thinking about lawyers, the only other profession. And here Hamilton, I think, meant just lawyers like himself. They were the ideal representatives. They truly form no distinct interest in the society, and according to their situation and talents, will have the confidence of most people in the society. They will feel a neutrality to the rivalships between the different branches of industry, and these are all the quotes from the Federalist 35, and were most likely to prove an impartial arbiter between them. They were the most capable of promoting in a disinterested manner whatever interest will be conducive to the general interests of the society. Wasn't it better, he asked, to have as a representative a man whose situation leads to extensive inquiry and information than someone whose observations does not travel beyond the circle of his neighbors and acquaintances? Such a far-sighted cosmopolitan representative would know the dispositions and inclinations of his fellow citizens and would be capable of creating strong cords of sympathy between himself and his constituents. I mean, that's a stark, the whole paper is a stark defense of virtual representation. Now, this is not the line that most Federalists wanted to take, because it's a very dangerous line, because it played right into the Anti-Federalist arguments. They would never buy into it, the other Federalists. Much too based on a hierarchical notion, they were trying to hide that. Instead, Madison, James Wilson, and most of the other Federalists sought to find some other arguments to justify and explain their new system of government. Faced with charges that they were trying to foist an aristocratic system on America, the Federalists quickly realized that they were better off rooting their promotion of the new Constitution in the realities of American political practices. None of this echoing a patron-client relationship or the kind of thing that Hamilton had in the Federalist 35. They had to show the country that they were as popular-minded as the Anti-Federalists. They needed to convince people that they believed in actual representation as much as the Anti-Federalists, and they would do so by drawing out the implications of actual representation and throwing these implications in the faces of their opponents. They had to convince the country and the Anti-Federalists that the Constitution was strictly Republican, strictly popular. And if they were going to do that, they had to find, as Madison put it, a Republican remedy for these Republican ills that had emerged over the previous decade. So they said something to this effect: you want representation? We'll give you representation. And they claimed that everything in the government was a representative of the people. The federal representatives, all elected officials, they said, are representatives. The federal representatives will represent the people. They will be the people and it is not probable that they will abuse themselves. Why should we fear so much greater dangers from our representatives in the federal government than from those we have in our state governments? All parts of all our governments, including the president, the governors, the senators, were equally the agents of the people. All branches of all governments in America were formed on the same principle, preserving throughout the representative, responsible character. These are extraordinary arguments. In other words, all parts of all governments in America were representatives. There's no difference between the federal government and the various state governments. These are radical, really momentous arguments. They suggested that both the state and federal governments, and indeed all branches of all governments, were all equally representatives of the people. This argument was made possible by developments that had taken place over the previous decade in debates over politics. By contending that all elected officials at both state and federal levels were equally agents of the people, these Federalists unleashed ideas that had about representation, all kinds of unanticipated consequences. Now, to understand what they had done, we have to go back to 1776 and the making of the revolutionary state constitutions. I think you can get a clear idea of what's new now in 1787. Now, in 1776, the constitution makers had assumed that the people were exclusively represented in the several houses of representatives, and each state had a house of representatives, and that's what they meant. The senates were not representative bodies. They were a kind of republicanized version of the mixed constitution that the English had. The senates were like the House of Lords, not hereditary, but they were to be made up of the wisest, the best people in the society. They're smaller than the houses of representatives, which is the really representative body, and these senates had no constituents. And the governors were, of course, the monarchical, representing the monarchical element in this mixed government, the idea of which goes back to Aristotle, which is what made the English Constitution such a celebrated thing in the 18th century, that it embodied these three simple forms of government. But it soon became impossible to talk about this in these terms, almost immediately. Well, I'll give you the example. You take the example of Pennsylvania, which had no governor and no upper house, no Senate. Reformers, mostly people who later became Federalists, wanted a Senate. They thought it would curb some of the excesses that were going on in the unicameral legislature of Pennsylvania. So they wanted an upper house, and they argued for it through the late 70s for a Senate, like the other states had. Well, the opponents of the defenders of the unicameral legislature, of the Pennsylvania Constitution, argued, well, what do we want a Senate for? You're trying to foist a House of Lords on us, and an aristocracy, and we don't want that, or we don't want the House of Lords. Well, the proponents of the Senate couldn't say, well, we want a House of Lords, we want an aristocratic body to counteract the democratic body. They couldn't say that. It became impossible to talk in those terms. So I said, no, we don't even want a Senate because we want a double representation of the people. A double representation of the people. Think about the implications of that. Now, if the people could be represented twice, why couldn't they be represented 3 times, 4 times? And that, of course, and that's exactly what happened. As people began thinking that all agents out there as in some way representatives of the people. And the senates were beginning to be thought of as equal representations of the people. Now, it took the Supreme Court 200 years to catch up with this. You know, Baker versus Carr and the representation decisions in the 1960s suddenly made all these state senates, they had to become much more proportionally representative, and they hadn't been in the past. But the original senates were not intended to be representative bodies. Now, this idea of representation is picked up by the Federalists in 1787 and used effectively to justify the Constitution. All government in a republic, whatever its nature or function, was something of a delegation by the people, and therefore all parts of the Republican system now seemed representative, essentially indistinguishable in their character. It was surprising, said John Dickinson, that some critics had declared that the Constitution was not sufficiently representative of the people, even though the whole people of the United States are to be trebly represented in it, in 3 different modes of representation. Now the House, the Senate, and the President are all representatives. Not only was the Senate representative of the people as representative of the people as the lower house, but even as Alexander Hamilton declared in the New York Ratifying Convention, the President of the United States will be himself the representative of the whole people. Now, if election was the criterion of representation, then it followed that all elected officials, including senators and governors, were representatives of the people. This actually made the term House of Representatives anachronistic. And it became, I think in time, although we don't think about it much today, a kind of awkward reminder of how we had once thought of popular representation, as the English had, actually, as just confined to the lower house of our legislatures. What you have here is the separation of government from society and a kind of detachment. You have all of these agents out there now, and the people remain below them, so to speak, delegating them. You have an abandon. Once you get away from the English mixed government, you abandon the notion of estates in the society, the society being embodied in the government, which is what made the English Constitution so remarkable, and of course gave Parliament, King and Parliament, its sovereignty. It was election by the people, not the number of chambers in the legislature, declared John Stevens of New Jersey, that made our governments the most democratic that ever existed anywhere. This is when you begin to have people saying, well, we don't have a mixed system, we have a democratic system. The people are everywhere in the system. And with us, concluded Wilson, James Wilson, the power of magistrates, call them by whatever name you please, are the grants of the people. Now, Wilson, I think, I think he's the equal of Madison, actually, in his ingeniousness, his imagination. He certainly comes up with the most imaginative answers to some of the Anti-Federalist criticism. He goes on to say, it was not just the upper houses that were now agents or representative of the people. Governors and judges, he says, were too. The Americans of 1776, he went on, had not clearly understood the nature of their executives and judiciaries. Although the authority of their governors and judges became in 1776 as much the child of the people as that of the legislatures, the people could not forget their traditional colonial aversion to the executive and judiciary and their fondness for their legislatures, which under the British monarchy had been the guardians of their rights and the anchor of their political hopes. Even at this time, Wilson noted with annoyance, people can scarcely divest themselves of these prepossessions. The legislatures often were still called the people's representatives, implying, though probably not avowed upon reflection, that the executive and judicial powers were not so strongly or closely connected with the people. But it is high time, said Wilson, that we should chastise our prejudices. The different parts of the government were functionally, but not substantively or socially different. The executive and judicial powers are now drawn from the same source, are now animated by the same principles, and are now directed to the same ends with the legislative authority. Those who execute and those who adjudicate the laws are as much the servants and therefore as much the friends of the people as those who make them. Truly extraordinary argument. Now, conceiving of the judges as just another kind of agent or servant of the people helped to make possible, of course, the emergence of what we came to call judicial review. And Hamilton suggested as much in his Federalist number 78, which some of you are familiar with. He wanted to justify judges setting aside acts of the legislature. Now, it's not easy to justify that. We've come to accept it pretty freely, but at the time, the idea of appointed officials setting aside an act of a popular legislature seemed very undemocratic. But what he says in that paper, who do those legislatures think they are? Who do they think they are? Do they think they're the people? They're not the people. The judges are as much the agents of the people as the legislators. Now, that's an extraordinary argument, but that's the gist of what he says. And that's where his justification is for judicial review. Judicial review, he said, did not by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposes that the power of the people is superior to both, and that where the will of the legislature expressed in its statutes stands in opposition to that of the people, which of course is declared in the constitutions, the judges ought to regulate their decisions by the fundamental law and not pay attention to the statutes. In other words, and of course this is made sensible by the development of the constitutional conventions, which there's another element that had developed, particularly by the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Convention is another representation of the people and stands aside and superior to the ordinary legislature. And that, of course, gives the Constitution a kind of superiority to the statutes, which are only passed by the legislatures. So these ideas are all flying around, and representation is spreading everywhere. Sovereignty lies with the people, and they never give it up entirely. Now, of course, this argument had consequences that Hamilton scarcely foresaw. He said, once judges began to be called agents of the people, as representative of the people as the legislators, some soon concluded, well, if they're representatives of the people, maybe we should elect them. And of course, the first reference that I've found of that argument is 1805. There may be others that I just haven't come across yet. But of course, it doesn't get implemented right away. It's only in the Jacksonian era that people begin electing judges, particularly in the new western states. And of course, as today, we have 39 states that elect their judges. If it weren't so hard to amend the Constitution, we would probably have the federal judges elected as well. Hamilton certainly never anticipated that argument to be picked up. But once he threw that out, people could pick it up and run with it. Now, ultimately, this new idea of representation created a very different conception of government from the English one that the Americans had thrown off. Because the English, with their virtual idea of representation, conceived of Parliament as embodying the whole society. All the estates of the realm are in Parliament. There's nothing outside. That gives sovereignty to Parliament. Parliament possessed full sovereignty. What they meant by sovereignty in the 18th century, and I suppose we still mean it, the final, supreme, indivisible lawmaking authority in the state. And by contrast, the Americans, with their acute idea of actual representation, indeed their acute mistrust of the representational process, necessarily concluded that sovereignty, if it had to exist, had to remain with the people themselves. It could not be delegated to any of their agents, or even all of their agents put together. The American people, unlike the English, were never eclipsed by the process of representation or election. When the English elected the House of Commons, that's it. They're out of business until the next election. And the whole society is in that Parliament, and therefore that Parliament can do anything, theoretically. And that's the notion of sovereignty. Americans never reached that point. Sovereignty, they use that argument comes up again, the issue of sovereignty, because the Anti-Federalists raise it and the Federalists have to answer it. They have to locate sovereignty in the people. It's Wilson who does that. He's a brilliant polemicist. So when they referred to the sovereignty of the people, they didn't mean just that the government was derived from the people. Everybody believed that. Even the all English Whigs believed that. But instead, they meant that the final, supreme, and indivisible lawmaking authority of the society remained with the people themselves, not with their representatives or with any of their agents. In America, thinking all public officials became delegated and mistrusted agents of the people. They were temporarily holding only bits and pieces of the people's power, which was, so to speak, out on temporary loan. But you keep the basic power yourselves. That's the conception that comes out of these debates. And actually, this creates a kind of disembodied, detached government, which is I think, an innovation in politics, certainly in Anglo-American politics. The English continued to think, up until very recently, that the whole society is in Parliament. We never reach that point. The society always remains outside, and we delegate bits and pieces of the people's power to these temporary agents. And the government sovereignty, therefore, is never embodied in any institution, or even all the institutions all put together. Now, by thinking of the people in this extraordinary way, Americans were able to conceive of federalism. You could delegate some powers to the federal government, some to the state governments, some to your constitutional convention, some to every institution had its bits and pieces of powers. And by creating two legislatures, operating with different powers, operating over the same territory, the Congress and the separate legislatures, state legislatures, Americans offered the world a new way of organizing government. Only by conceiving of sovereignty remaining with the people could Americans make sense of their new constitutional achievements, which I think are quite extraordinary. The Constitutional Convention, the idea of ratification of constitutions. Now, the English didn't need conventions, a constitutional convention, or popular ratification to change their constitution, because the whole society was already in Parliament and King. And the people did not exist politically or constitutionally outside of it, except at the moment of election. Now, this is changing in England, and has been changing over the last half century. Once the English had a referendum on an important issue, like joining the EU, then you've opened up a gap, if you think about it, between the Parliament and the people. And that is a kind of gap. Of course, we have a big gap, but they have opened a little gap that could be worrisome for English constitutionalists. And they also have begun using judicial review, but not by appealing to treaties that the English Parliament has signed having to do with human rights and with the EU. And some judges are beginning using those. But this is a beginning of something that is really quite small compared to what Americans do. Now, this wasn't just a convenient political fiction, as my good friend Ed Morgan has argued. The American people, unlike the English, retained an actual lawmaking authority. It's not a fiction, this idea of sovereignty of the people. And this has been used throughout our history, and particularly in the progressive era, when you begin to get all these reforms of ballot initiatives, referendums, and processes of recall introduced by progressive reformers at the beginning of the 20th century. These are only extensions of the idea of actual representation carried to an extreme. These expressions of direct democracy, of course, are based on a mistrust of the representational system, and they are extreme expressions of actual representation. Now, we in the East aren't much plagued by this direct democracy to the extent that people in the West are. But if one is from California or Oregon or Colorado, it is a really major problem of how you handle these examples of direct democracy. So far, most Americans seem content with the representational process, although the reputation, as you know, of the Congress is about as low as it's ever been. And with that reputation, and with the reputation of most state legislatures, the cry for more direct democracy is likely to grow in the coming years. And I don't know, who knows where it'll take us? I mean, I would say by the middle of this century, with everybody all wired up, technically speaking, it'll be possible for all of us to vote on the national budget. And I wouldn't be surprised if some congressman someday suggests that. And so on April 15th, we'll all sit around our computers and vote on the national budget. Won't that be fun? That's where representation has taken us. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions, comments.
And please come on down if you have a question. Or come on up to the mic in your case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually have a question that will follow up on a small point that you made, but it's of great interest to me, and it's about the age. So you said that people who were young could not vote. And so could you please follow up a little bit and say if people who actually were the people, who were the citizenry, with whom the sovereignty resided, had some kind of restriction in terms of age, both on the young side and on the older side. And similarly, those who were members of those representative bodies. So what happened with them? So what were the margins?
They had an age restriction, which we used to have, of 21. They had also, this, I'm talking about the early state constitutions, they had some of them had property qualifications, which were not great, but certainly the idea behind these qualifications of various sorts was based on independence. They wanted people who were independent. They felt that women, of course, were not independent. They were dependent on their husbands or their fathers. And young men are dependent on their fathers and their families. Therefore, they should be excluded from the suffrage. That would have been the rationale. Independence was crucial. You don't want someone voting because they're not a free person. And, of course, slaves or other servants could not vote. There was no upper limit. Nobody was excluded because they were too old. But the point that should be made is that this is the largest suffrage of any state in the world at the time. So whatever the restrictions might be by modern standards, you have to take that into account. As I say, in England, didn't come close to having the kind of suffrage that we had. Yeah.
What was the role and purpose of the Electoral College in their thinking?
The Electoral College came about because they could not agree on how the president should be elected. Now, they did suggest, in fact, it was Wilson who suggested direct election by the people. That was dismissed not because they mistrusted the people, they just didn't know how, once they get past Washington, how would the people know whom to vote for? They didn't conceive of political parties with platforms and candidates nominated. They didn't conceive of modern media. So they said, well, once we get past George Washington, how would the people in Massachusetts know who's notable in South Carolina to vote for? So they went back and forth. They said, well, let's have the Congress vote for the president. They said, well, that'll make the president dependent on the Congress. All right, well, then have the president have a 7-year term not eligible for re-election. That way, once he's elected, he'll be free of the Congress. He won't have to kowtow to them. That's how the debate went. 7 years was too long, they said, for a man to wield that kind of power. So they went back and forth, and they finally said, let's create an alternative Congress with one function only. And that's the electoral, what we call the, they didn't call it the Electoral College, it's going to be an alternative Congress. It had the same numbers of people that existed in the other Congress. It's going to be made up of equally talented people from the various localities. And these notables, and that's who they expected would be elected to this Electoral College, would know whom to vote for. Who are the prominent people? Who are the people who are talented? And that's how we came about. Now, it really, once you got past Washington, it really worked the way it was intended to work. And it had to be reformed once you had parties emerging with the 12th Amendment.
You made me think about why I should accept a representative who doesn't share my views. What is the theory behind that? That somebody is elected by majority who does not represent my views, and then I should consider him my representative.
That's a real problem. And I think that's why Whately was smart enough to realize that. And therefore, the English system of virtual representation makes sense of majority rule. Otherwise, if you come to believe that election is the criterion of representation and the sole criterion of representation, then you don't feel represented by the person that lost. If you voted for the man or the person who lost, then are you represented? And you've raised that question. Virtual representation handles that problem because they say, well, there's a mutuality of interest that exists. Even if you didn't vote for him, he's looking after your interest. He or she's looking after your interest today. That is the justification for majority rule. Otherwise, it's a real problem. There's no logical reason why you should believe in majority rule. And of course, it's being contested all over. The Arab Spring is all about this. Minorities don't feel safe, and they're protesting. Sunnis in Iraq don't feel safe under Shia rule, and they're responding by bombing, blowing up their opponents. It's a really tricky issue. You have to have enough confidence, enough mutuality of interest, I suppose, to believe that even if you lost, your guy lost, that the 101 is still going to look after the interest of your constituency. Now, the English, at least in theoretical terms, Burkean terms, he shouldn't be looking after your constituency only, he should be looking after the whole country's interest. But as you know, we have 435 representatives, and there are 435 different interests, and as many speakers have said, it's like herding cats to get them to look after a general interest, and of course, that's being brought home to us especially with the Republican majority in the House. How to herd those cats together the speaker is having a hard time doing that. But you raise a very fundamental question of political theory. Where does majority rule come? I mean, why would we accept the majority? Except it's practical. Otherwise, the alternative is fighting. But there isn't any other rationale for it, I suppose. Yeah.
If everybody represents you, then nobody represents you. At one point, I like how you developed the idea, how you made the point that Hamilton in 35 pretty much gave the game away, at any rate for the Federalists. And then you said, if I'm not mistaken, that the other Federalists tried to hide that argument.
Yeah, they don't follow it up.
And they came up with various notions of double and triple representation. How much of this was a concerted effort, and how much of this that emerged, these notions that emerged organically, if you will, in the sort of Federalist political thinking?
Well, it's hard to know. I think it emerges, they read what each other is saying, and they begin to see. I think they immediately knew, walking out of that convention, Dickinson had made it explicit, look, you're going to get aristocracy thrown in your faces. Be prepared. And so they go to these conventions, ratifying conventions, knowing what the principal arguments are going to be. And so they are prepared in that sense. But they do grow upon one another. I should say about Hamilton, he hadn't yet got the notion, he hadn't realized that a requirement for disingenuousness in popular politics, he hadn't yet got that message. It's something that, of course, we're well aware of today. Very few of our politicians are not disingenuous. They just have to be. All those gaffes that you hear about are usually truthful statements that they've made about reality that the American public won't accept. And so Hamilton he hadn't got quite that. He did a better job in the ratifying debates. He was very shrewd, and he gave Melancthon Smith, or I should put it the other way around, Melancthon Smith actually, uneducated, gave Hamilton and Livingston a real run for their money. Now I've forgotten, you remind me again of your point, which was...
conspiracy or...
concerted. I think, to give you a good example, they were really befuddled by the Anti-Federalist argument that this is going to lead to a consolidation. And it's going to lead to a consolidation because of the Supremacy Clause. And they invoked the old idea of sovereignty, which had been the sticking point in the imperial crisis. If there has to be, in every state, one final supreme lawmaking authority, where will it go? The Anti-Federalist says, there's no doubt it's going to end up in the federal government, and our states are going to be drained from all power, and they'll end up measuring the height of fence posts and laying out roads, and that's what we'll do, all innocuous stuff. And they kept hammering that home about sovereignty, which was the very issue over which the empire broke, because the colonists wouldn't accept parliamentary sovereignty, and yet the British kept saying, there's no dividing of sovereignty, it's indivisible. So you either accept, if you accept one iota of Parliament's power, you get to accept it all. That's the way it works. And of course, it says, if you don't accept one iota, then you have to be independent. Well, they thought that was such an awesome thing that the colonists would never say that, but they did. In 74, they say we're thus independent, we're tied to the empire only through the king. And from 74 to 76, that's the way they're all legally minded, so they keep that very strict. And that's why the Declaration of Independence, if you read through it, it says nothing about Parliament. It says you, George III, have done this because they didn't have to. They had already gotten rid of Parliament because they'd been forced to get rid of Parliament, so they only have the tie to the king, and they never mention the parliamentary statutes, which of course are the things that bothered them, the Stamp Act, the towns and duties, and so on. And they say, you, George III, have done this, this, and this. And then the closest they come and say, you, George III, with others, have conspired. Others are the Parliament. Now, the Anti-Federalists throw the same argument in the faces of the Federalists. What are they going to do? They keep saying, oh, no, we're going to divide sovereignty. Some powers are going to be with the federal government, some with the state governments. And the Anti-Federalist says, no, you can't divide sovereignty. It's all going to end up being in the federal government. And finally, it's James Wilson, brilliant speech he gives out of doors, first in Philadelphia and then in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, who latches on and says, we're not going to divide sovereignty. We accept the notion of sovereignty. We're not going to try to divide it, only we're going to relocate it. We're going to put it in the people. And of course, the Anti-Federalists don't know what to do with that. That's a very brilliant argument. And they're going to dole out little bits and pieces. It's Wilson who understands the system better than anyone of the Federalists. And the others, as soon as they read this speech or hear about it, they pick it up and run with it. And Madison, at first, doesn't quite follow this. He's a little confused about how we're going to handle this. But they all pick it up right away, and sovereignty remains with the people, and that becomes the solution to their problem. So that it's not, I mean, they must have talked to one another at various times when they were together, but when they read about what others had said in previous state debates, and Pauline Mayer's book, I think, shows this, they begin picking up what other arguments, and they begin, there's no concerted, but it is based on reading each other's stuff and finding what are the best arguments we can use. And it's as I say, it's a laboratory of how ideas change under popular pressure. I mean, Quentin Skinner's notion of intellectual history is justified and revealed by these debates as well as any place I've ever seen, because everything's so concentrated within 18 months or so. You have these extraordinary changes and new understanding of politics that emerge out of these intellectual contests. Yeah.
Professor Wood, it's really a privilege to have you here. 2 points I wonder if you could number one, can you shed light on the discussions, if any, that our founders had about the regulation of commerce, especially as it applies to what's going on today with the Supreme Court? And number 2, did they have any discussions about term limits of Supreme Court justices?
They, of course, their conception of commerce was not at all what we've now come to think of commerce, and they certainly would not have anticipated the present situation. Not that that makes I mean, judicial determinations have enlarged the commerce power to the point where the government can do almost anything. Now, whether they can do what the Obama's medical bill proposes is up for, we'll see. But that commerce power has expanded beyond anything they could have imagined. But judicial, even Marshall had some imaginative uses of the commerce power, but it certainly was not in the minds of the framers when they were drawing this up. They didn't think through that. How is this going to be thought of, 20 years? If Hamilton couldn't anticipate when he talked about judges being agents of the people, if he couldn't anticipate elected judges, then you see that people don't always anticipate how their ideas are going to be picked up and used against them or in contrary ways. And now, what was the other? You had another. Oh, term limits. Yeah, the states actually did have term limits on some of their representatives. Term limits for judges, the Federalist Congress creates the judiciary, and of course, Article 3 creates the Supreme Court. And there's no term limits there, and so they actually gave a greater power to our judges than even the English judges. Now, since the Act of Settlement, the beginning of the 18th century, English judges could not be removed by the king for anything except misbehavior. In other words, they weren't at the will of the king. But, and this is, a lot of people forget this, the Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords could, by majority vote, call for the king to remove a judge. And that was actually written into the Massachusetts state constitution by John Adams. So what the federal judges achieved was a greater longevity, more independence than any judges in the English-speaking world at that time. The federal judges have, they have no age limits, nothing. Every state in the Union has some kind of limits, except my own. And Rhode Island is, according to Akil Amar, my state of Rhode Island is the only one whose judicial tenure is exactly the same as the federal judges, which is lifetime appointment, no qualifications. Every other judge in the states has some kind of qualification. Either it's age or election or some kind of limit. So they have, one of the great Federalist achievements, not only creating the Constitution, but then their subsequent Federalist Party, was the creation of the judicial system. And they certainly, because it was not, it was immune to popular pressure, they reveled in their creation of the judiciary, and Marshall made the most of it, of course, in his long tenure. Yes, sir.
I took your survey course in 1975. It's good to see that neither of us have changed.
Yeah.
Something stuck, and after I got my history degree, there were a long series of detours. And I'm now finishing my 10th year teaching at a local public high school. And the question I have for you is a combination of a basic question, what gets you up in the morning? And what could you say to my high school students about why they should care about the study of history?
Wow. I mean, you could give the conventional, without a sense of, history is another mode of understanding. It's not just information about the past, it's another sense. It gives you a richer sense of reality. And without it, you're kind of two-dimensional. It gives you a fourth dimension, if you will, to the world you live in. And I can't imagine anyone not having, it's akin to memory, but it's not just memory for an individual. It's a society without a history is a society that has no idea where it's going, because you wouldn't know where you've been. You won't know what you're about. So I don't think, there's no easy answer to this. It's just that I can't imagine a world that is not interested in history. And you have to be interested in the future in order to be interested in history. P.D. James had a wonderful book, something of man, Child of Man, where she doesn't have her usual Adam Daglish detective. She imagines a world where, and I think they made a movie of it, which I haven't seen, but nobody's been born after the age of 25. I mean, the youngest person in the whole world is 25. There hasn't been another birth since. And it's set in England, very history-minded society. And what happens to history when there's no future? And because your hero is a historian. And if you don't believe in the future, then you don't care about the past. And the past is just sort of falling away. So it seems to me that kids of all people should be interested, because they're interested in the future, but they've got to have history in order to make their way in the future. But there are a lot of answers that one could get to that question. Yeah, Stephen.
I wish I'd been in your class in 1975. I was actually introduced to this area of political thought and political history by Herbert Storen, who devoted a tremendous amount of his work to
Right.
working on the Anti-Federalists.
Right.
the complete Anti-Federalists, but he had a slightly strange reason, it seemed, for doing it. He wanted to take their arguments seriously, give them the attention they deserve, but ultimately to show why Federalists were right in the long run. And at least in the best formulation of his argument I remember, he said this was one of those happy moments in history where you could say the better argument won out, the Federalist argument. I take, although you didn't put it that way, I sort of took you to be saying that, or something like it, that here was a case, you spoke about the Kenyan thesis, the men of little faith, and so on. But it seemed to me you were saying that the Federalists simply had the better argument. And I was wondering if you could just, if you accept that, could you restate, I got somewhat lost in the forest, I think. What was the better argument, do you think, that the Federalists
Well,
had on
that's the way a political theorist would pose the question. A historian would not. I mean, the Federalists won, but as Pauline Mayer shows in her really wonderful book on ratification, there was a lot of conniving. They had the whole elite was on their side, you know, Franklin and Washington. They had 90% of the newspapers on their side. And it still was a close-run thing. And in fact, if there had been a kind of modern referendum or modern poll-taking, there's no doubt the majority of the people in the country were opposed to this Constitution. I mean, think of it. They just fought a war to far-removed political power, and now they've created this government, this strong federal government, and we know it's strong because it's the same government essentially we have today. 10 years after they had repudiated one, it was unanticipated, unexpected, and it was so novel that it's amazing it got through. I think that points to the seriousness of the crisis, and that's why I'm not satisfied with explanations to say, well, you know, the articles weren't working so well, and they needed a taxing power and so on. Of course that's true, but everyone accepted that. All the Anti-Federalists accepted the idea that there had to be some additional powers given to the articles. But what they didn't expect was what they got. They didn't expect this Virginia plan, and they certainly didn't, and of course even that was modified and lessened to the actual Constitution. I think as a historian, and I talked to Pauline about this because, you know, when I first knew Pauline years ago, she was such an avid Federalist, and she wrote a critique of my book saying, and she more or less, it read like a Federalist paper. She was so on the side of the Federalists. And so I said to her, well, how did you come out after writing this book? She said, I'm much more sympathetic to the Anti-Federalists, she said. And I think she came to appreciate someone like William Finley, who became a kind of hero for me, because, well, it has to do with a lot of, I suppose, your attitude. Some of these Federalists could be, like James Wilson could be such an arrogant ass. I mean, I'll give you one anecdote that just illustrates this, and Pauline uses it, and I've used it. Finley has no education, but he's arguing in the ratifying debates, and he makes the statement, well, the Swedes lost power once they got rid of jury trials. Well, Wilson's on his feet, says, jury trials? The Swedes never had jury trials. Thomas McKean, who's Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, he laughs at McKinley. He says, what's a jerk like you saying things like that? There was no, and Finley says, look, I read it somewhere, I'll find it. Well, he comes in 2 days later, and he says, I got my source. He has two sources, actually, but one of them is Blackstone. Blackstone, the Bible for lawyers. McKean had enough decency to remain quiet. Wilson has to get up and say, well, he says, I know there are people who know so much that they can't remember everything. And he says, and I know more about history and the law than you'll ever know. And that's a kind of, and so you have to feel, geez, that Finley. And of course, one thing that does come out of these debates is that, if you want to relate it to our own time, a lot of these Anti-Federalists, because they're very naive about things, and they concoct this notion that the District of Columbia is going to be some horror show with all the dancing girls and wine and so on. But there's some very strong resemblance to the Tea Party people, if you read these Anti-Federalists. And so I think what it does, and I think this is what history does in general, is give you a kind of, it takes you off of a roller coaster of emotions. It gives you a kind of sympathy for everyone. Everyone's a victim. And you certainly do have some sympathy for the Anti-Federalists. Of course, they actually win. They lose the battle, but they win the fight over the next half century at least, because Jefferson rides to power with their support. It's Anti-Federalist support that really makes Jefferson. By 1808 in Pennsylvania, Simon Snyder's elected governor. He's got no education at all. He's accused of being a clodhopper. And he says, that's right, I'm a clodhopper in a society of clodhoppers, and he makes that his campaign slogan, and he wins. And then Daniel Tompkins in New York, he's a wealthy Columbia lawyer from New York City. So what does he campaign? He wants to be governor, campaigns as a farmer's boy. Already, the Anti-Federalists have won, rhetorically, in every way. The anti-intellectualism, the anti-elitism of American life is there right from the beginning, in the North in particular. And that only changes in the post-Civil War period, and we still have a lot of it today, as you know. I mean, candidates have to be plebeian. They can't reveal themselves. There's disingenuousness all over our politics. And that's democracy. There's no getting away. If you try to be honest, you just get killed at the polls. So it's an indictment, I suppose, of democracy, but what is the alternative? So the Anti-Federalists are interesting from a lot of points of view because they do reveal the future, at least the immediate future, because the Federalists really are left, as you know, they really go out of business by, as a party, by 1820, they don't put a candidate up. So I think that debate is revealing of a lot of the issues that are still with us. Elitism, they didn't use that term, they used aristocracy, but that's what they meant. And people who are acting proud and acting superior. People go to college, are snobs. I mean, that kind of statement. It's repulsive in a sense, and yet if you realize back then they were saying the same things. It helps get you some sense of balance and some perspective on your own time, because you realize we've been there before and we survived that. We survived the Civil War. We'll get through this time too.